talk today about respiratory structures. If you haven't done task 1 yet at the back of your booklet on page 15, make sure you do that when you're done this lesson. So yesterday we talked a little bit about the 4 different types of breathing and how your airways, so your nasal cavity and your trachea, are specifically lined with mucus and hairs to help keep dust and germs out of the lungs. So we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about some of those respiratory structures or organs today. So the nasal cavity is the entrance for air. It leads to open spaces in the nose or the nostrils. It has those mucous membranes to secrete mucus. And again, mucus work with the cilia, those small hair-like structures or tiny hairs, to collect dust, bacteria, and other particles in the air. Mucus also helps to moisten the air and the capillaries under the membranes to help keep warm the air as it comes through. So your nose has a natural filtration. Again, there's lots of blood vessels in your nose. That's why if you get hit in the nose or something, it bleeds a lot. And that's to help warm, moisten, and filter the air. Coming back to that pharynx again. So another word for the pharynx is the throat, but pharynx is kind of the more scientific word, so that's the word I would like you to use for today. And it's that shared passage for air and food. So it's a funnel-shaped passageway that connects the nasal and oral cavities to the larynx. Again, that's just a fancy way of saying shared passage for air and food. So it collects warm, moist air, and it passes it down towards the windpipe. So here's our nose and our nasal cavities, and right kind of there is that pharynx or throat. Here is the epiglottis. We talked about the epiglottis when we talked about swallowing. So the epiglottis is a flap of tissue that guards the entrance to the larynx. So the larynx is just the top of the trachea or windpipe. So when you swallow food, the larynx moves up, and against the epiglottis, it folds down as well to help prevent food from getting into the larynx and down into the trachea or lungs, because that can be really dangerous. The larynx is the voice box, so that's that big structure at the top. It contains your vocal cords. It's a passageway for air to travel between the pharynx and the trachea, and it's made mostly of cartilage. So cartilage is like the stuff that your ears are made out of, or that kind of very end of your nose is made out of. Hard but flexible material. So your vocal cords kind of look like this. So they're 2 pairs of membranes that are stretched across the inside of the larynx. As the air is expired, so you make your sound as you're breathing out. The vocal cords vibrate. The pitch of the voice depends on the length, thickness, and degree of elasticity of those vocal cords and the tension at which they're held. So if if there's kind of a narrow glottis there, it's a high pitch sound. If it's wider, it's going to make a lower pitch sound. The trachea is also known as your windpipe. It's the main passage leading from the larynx to the bronchi. So that's where the air goes. So after you're breathing it in through the nose or the mouth, it goes to the pharynx, goes past that epiglottis that would cover up the opening if you were swallowing. But in this case, the air is going to get through the larynx, and that trachea is the main passage that gets the air from the larynx, so that voice box, down into the bronchi that's going to take it to each lung. So it's kept open by rings of cartilage, so it kind of looks like a vacuum hose. So I've kind of drawn a picture here. And again, it's covered with those tiny hairs of cilia and mucous membranes, again, to keep dust or whatever out of the lungs. So if you actually run your finger up and down the front of your throat, don't push too hard, but you can sometimes feel those cartilaginous rings. And again, the trachea is always kept open. We always want a nice passage for air, which is opposed to the esophagus that would run right behind it, that when you swallow, that's where your food goes down into your stomach, which is a muscle that's kind of mostly closed, and it only opens more like a snake when food is there. So trachea always open, getting that air into our lungs. So bronchi, okay, so plural is bronchi. If you're talking about both bronchi, it's bronchi. If it's singular, it's bronchus. So you have your left and right bronchus, one for each lung. So these are the branches down here that take the air from the trachea to each lung, the left and the right lung. They subdivide into bronchioles. So just smaller and smaller tubes as they go through. So it gets smaller and smaller and smaller till it ends up in these tiny air sacs called alveoli. So as the bronchi divide further and further, they get smaller and the walls get thinner. So I often tell people to think of the lungs like grapes. So you have your big main stem of your grapes, and then it divides into smaller and smaller kind of branches until you get to the actual grape part, and that would be those air sacs, the alveoli. So these are tiny sacs of tissue that hold the air breathed in. Each bronchiole ends in these bunches of alveoli. Walls of the alveoli are only about 1 cell thick. They're surrounded by the capillaries. These capillaries help to exchange gases and give off carbon dioxide into the alveoli and gain oxygen from the alveoli. So when we get air comes down the trachea, into the bronchi, into the left and right lung, subdivide into those bronchioles and end with these tiny air sacs. So they kind of look like, again, like these grapes here. And here is kind of our smaller and smaller divides of our bronchioles. Okay, so again, another picture here. Again, this picture is nice because it shows, even though it's kind of a mess, all those capillaries surrounding each air sac. So as the blue is coming in, that would be coming from your pulmonary artery, carrying that deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart. At the alveoli, the carbon dioxide would diffuse out, the oxygen would diffuse in, it would get red, it would go back from the capillaries to the arterioles, or sorry, the venules, and then back to the pulmonary vein to the left side of the heart, because those pulmonary veins and arteries are the only ones that carry kind of the opposite, right? Here's just another picture. So here, my scrawl, sorry, from the pulmonary artery going into this capillary. Here's the capillary here. The carbon dioxide would be high here, high concentration here. Oh, let's move it back for a second. When it arrives, carbon dioxide would be high concentration in the blood. Oxygen would be high concentration in the alveoli. It would diffuse from high concentration to low concentration, and both of these are about 1 cell thick, so it's just simple diffusion, high to low. Carbon dioxide would diffuse out from high to low, and then this carbon dioxide would go back out the bronchi, the trachea, to be exhaled, and this oxygenated blood would head to the left atrium via that pulmonary vein, which is the only vein in the body to carry oxygenated blood. Your ribs are really important. They surround and protect your chest or thoracic cavity. They move to a certain degree, helping the lungs expand. So you've got your rib muscles here, and then they've got, or your ribs here, and then they're kind of attached by these, what we call intercostal muscles. Okay. And the ribs will move up and out to help that chest cavity expand, and that helps the lungs grow, or move kind of down and in when you exhale, and we'll talk about that more another day. So your ribs protect your lungs. Your right lung is divided into 3 lobes. So your right lung is actually bigger than your left lung. The left lung is only divided into 2 lobes. It's a little bit smaller to make room for the heart that sits just on the left side of your body. Each lobe is divided into lobules, which contain a bronchiole and many alveoli. So the lobes are like a balloon filled with a sponge-like tissue. Because the lungs would contain so much airspace, they're actually really light and would actually float in water. And your lungs are surrounded by what's called the pleural membrane, or pleura, the membrane that surrounds each of the lungs. So it separates the lungs from the chest wall, and there's a little bit of fluid between those 2 layers that reduces that friction during breathing. And at the bottom of your chest cavity, there's a strong muscle called the diaphragm. So this is a strong wall of muscle. It actually separates the abdominal cavity from that thoracic cavity. So when the diaphragm contracts, it actually flattens and moves down. So that's really important to know. When the diaphragm contracts, it flattens and moves down. And again, it's making that chest cavity a little bit bigger to allow the lungs to expand when you inhale. When it relaxes, it goes back up, and it's kind of this concave or dome shaped. So when it's relaxed, it moves up into this dome shape, and when it contracts, it flattens. So again, important to know. And here's just another little kind of piece, and we'll talk about inhalation and what causes breathing and the air to move in again in a future lesson. So again, the air is coming down into the trachea to each of the lungs as you breathe in. That diaphragm is moving down. As you exhale, the diaphragm's moving up, and it's making the lungs a little bit smaller, and that's going to help to force some of that air out. Again, when you're inhaling, your chest cavity is expanding a little bit, so those rib muscles are moving up and out, and that diaphragm is moving down. When you're exhaling, the chest is kind of moving down and in, making the lungs quite a bit smaller, you can see in those pictures, and the diaphragm is moving up in that relaxed position. So those are the structures of the lungs, or so the respiratory system. Again, if you haven't had a chance to do task 1, make sure you do it, and have a great day.